fear sits behind a whole lot of emotional responses that drive certain behaviours. We need to understand a little bit about the science behind the human brain. What the science tells us is that the human brain actually developed in 3 separate stages. The first brain that developed was the survival part of the brain, and that survival brain, that's the brain that kept us protected way back in the times of the cavemen, where there was lots of physical threats out in the world, and so that brain is extremely important in keeping us safe and protected. And the survival part of the brain is what governs the fear response in us. So that is what this lesson is going to explore. The survival brain is also known as the reptilian brain and often nicknamed as the croc or the lizard brain. The survival brain is responsible for the initial filtering of all messages coming towards us, and it generates most of the survival fight-flight responses. What it also does is govern those strong emotional responses that we feel when we're under threat. That can be physical threat, or it can be other types, like when we're getting into an argument or we've had a response that is different to what we wanted or we thought we were going to have, that emotion rise. That's all coming from the survival brain producing that emotion, and what it does is it kicks off fight-flight response in our brain. If you are a fighter or you're dealing with fighters, the croc is a wonderful nickname to use because it's understanding that this part of the brain has been activated and that crocodile is coming out, whereas the lizard is quite appropriate if you are a freezer or even someone that tends to take off. And it's just recognizing that that lizard brain is a teeny little brain, a reptilian brains are tiny brains with very limited capacities, and that's exactly what happens when our survival brain is triggered, which is every time in those spaces of conflict, whether they're internal conflicts, whether they're conflicts with other people. It's where fear is present, where anxiety is present, we're actually governed from this part of the brain. And so the important thing to know and remember is that this brain is limited in its ability and to think and function. It's not the thinking part of our brain, and that is why when we're in this space it is so difficult to see beyond it. So it simply does not have a lot of capacity. What its job is to do is to keep us alive. And so that served us well back in the times when there was lots of external threats such as tigers and crocodiles and all those things in our environment. Whereas nowadays those types of threats are much less common, but we're using that part of the brain to respond to perceived threats, whether they're from other people, whether they're from our own overthinking, our anxiety, our fear of the future. And so this part of the brain gets triggered constantly, doing its job to keep us safe and alive, but actually really getting in the way a lot of the time. The big thing to know about the reptilian brain is that it promotes a resistance to change. So when you're amongst people that are change resistant, or you yourself struggle with change, knowing that it's actually governed by being constantly driven by that survival part of the brain is quite useful. The survival brain actually needs to filter the threat before we can get through to the emotional part of the brain, which creates the meaning aspect of that threat. And beyond the emotional brain lies the thinking brain, which is where we actually do all of that logical, reasoning, creative application work. And so you can see that when we're stuck in survival mode, especially in the workplace, when we're fighting each other, whether that's internally or externally or ourselves, we're not actually able to get to a place of meaning, or even further in terms of that innovation, creativity, and the inspired place that really makes us thrive in the workplace.